My name is Rebecca Martinez, and at 32 years old, I was standing in the Denver airport with my boarding pass to Phoenix, clutching a secret that would either heal my fractured family or destroy what little relationship we had left. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows as I waited to board the plane that would take me to my father's retirement party after 4 years of silence between us. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed my sister Carmen's number one last time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The call went straight to voicemail, just like the previous 12 attempts over the past 2 days. I should have expected this. When I had called my mother 3 weeks ago to tell her I was coming to Dad's retirement celebration, the line had gone dead silent for a full 30 seconds before she finally spoke. "Rebecca, I don't think that's such a good idea," she had whispered, as if someone might overhear. "Your father is still very hurt about what happened with the wedding. Maybe it's better if you just send a card." But I couldn't just send a card, not when I knew what I knew. Not when I had spent the last 4 years carrying the weight of a truth that could change everything. As the gate agent called for boarding, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that in less than 3 hours, I would be facing the family who had written me off as the daughter who chose her career over love, the one who had abandoned tradition for ambition, the one who had broken their hearts by calling off my engagement to David Hernandez, just 2 weeks before what was supposed to be the wedding of the century in our tight-knit Phoenix community. Growing up in Phoenix as the youngest of 3 daughters in the Martinez family meant living under the constant warmth of the desert sun and the even more constant expectations of a family deeply rooted in tradition. Our house on Cactus Road was a sprawling adobe-style home that my father Miguel Martinez had built with his own hands when he was just 25 years old. He was a man who believed in creating something lasting, something that would stand as a testament to his hard work and dedication to family. My father had started Martinez Construction with nothing more than a pickup truck, a toolbox, and an unwavering determination to provide for his wife and daughters. By the time I was in high school, his company had become one of the most respected construction firms in Arizona, building everything from luxury homes in Scottsdale to commercial complexes throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. He was the kind of man who woke up at 5 every morning, even on Sundays, because he believed that success came to those who were willing to outwork everyone else. My mother Rosa had been his high school sweetheart, and their love story was the stuff of local legend. They had married when she was 19 and he was 21, and she had devoted her entire life to supporting his dreams while raising their 3 daughters. She was the heart of our family, the one who organized every holiday celebration, remembered every birthday, and somehow managed to make our house feel like a sanctuary from the outside world. My oldest sister Carmen was 35 and had followed the path that my parents had always envisioned for all their daughters. She had married her college boyfriend, Tony Ramirez, when she was 23, and they had built a beautiful life together with their 2 children, Sophia and Miguel Jr. Named after our father. Carmen worked part-time as a teacher at the local elementary school, but her primary role was as a mother and wife, supporting Tony's career as an accountant, while maintaining the kind of home that my mother had taught us was the foundation of happiness. My middle sister, Isabella, had taken a slightly different path, but one that still aligned with family expectations. She had pursued a nursing degree and worked at Phoenix Children's Hospital, but she had also married young to her husband, Carlos, who was a police officer. They had struggled with fertility issues for years, something that had caused my mother endless worry and had led to countless novenas and prayers for a grandchild. Isabella was 33 and had always been the most diplomatic of the 3 of us, the one who could smooth over conflicts and find common ground between opposing viewpoints. And then there was me, Rebecca, the baby of the family, the one who had always been just a little bit different. While my sisters had played house and dreamed of their wedding days, I had spent my childhood following my father around construction sites, fascinated by the process of turning blueprints into reality. I had learned to read architectural drawings before I could properly tie my shoes, and I had developed a deep appreciation for the mathematics and engineering that went into creating structures that would last for generations. In high school, while my sisters were focused on finding boyfriends and planning for marriage, I was buried in advanced mathematics and physics classes, driven by a curiosity about how things worked and a desire to understand the principles that governed the physical world. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, had recognized my aptitude and had encouraged me to consider pursuing engineering in college, something that had never occurred to anyone in my family. The conversation about my future had taken place during my senior year, around the dinner table that my father had crafted himself from reclaimed mesquite wood. It was a Sunday evening, and the family had gathered for our weekly dinner, a tradition that my mother had maintained since Carmen was born. The smell of her homemade enchiladas filled the air, and the conversation had been flowing easily until I mentioned that I had been accepted to Arizona State University's engineering program. My father had repeated, setting down his fork and looking at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. "Mija, why would you want to study engineering? That's a man's field. You'll be competing against men who have been thinking about this their whole lives." "But I have been thinking about it my whole life too, Dad," I had responded, feeling my cheeks flush with a combination of embarrassment and frustration. "I've been watching you build things since I was little. I understand construction and design. I want to learn how to do it properly, with all the technical knowledge behind it." My mother had jumped in with her gentle but firm voice. "Rebecca, you're so intelligent and beautiful, you could do anything you want. Why not consider teaching, like Carmen, or nursing, like Isabella? Those are stable careers that work well with family life." "What if I don't want family life to be my primary focus?" I had asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. My sisters exchanged glances across the table, and my parents looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Every woman wants family life to be her primary focus," my father had said finally, his tone gentle but definitive. "That's what makes life meaningful. A career is just something to fill the time until you find the right man and start building something real together." Despite their concerns, my parents had ultimately supported my decision to pursue engineering, though I could tell they viewed it as a phase that I would eventually outgrow. They had paid for my tuition and expenses, and my father had even expressed pride when I had graduated summa cum laude with my degree in structural engineering. But I could sense that they were waiting for me to come to my senses and settle down into the life they had always envisioned for me. The pressure had intensified after graduation when I had taken a position with Henderson Engineering, one of Phoenix's most prestigious engineering firms. I had thrown myself into my work with the same intensity that my father had brought to building his business, often working late into the evening on complex structural calculations and design modifications. My projects ranged from high-rise office buildings to intricate bridge designs, and I found myself energized by the intellectual challenges and the satisfaction of solving problems that seemed impossible at first glance. It was during my second year at Henderson Engineering that I had met David Hernandez, the man who would eventually become my fiancé, and then the source of the greatest conflict my family had ever experienced. David was a successful real estate developer who had worked with our firm on several major projects, and he had impressed me with his knowledge of the industry and his sophisticated approach to complex developments. David was everything that my parents could have hoped for in a son-in-law. He was successful, handsome, and came from a respected Mexican-American family that had been in Phoenix for 3 generations. His father owned a chain of successful restaurants throughout the Southwest, and David had expanded the family business into real estate development, building luxury residential communities and commercial properties throughout Arizona and Nevada. When David had started showing interest in me, my family had been overjoyed. Here was a man who could provide security and social status, someone who understood the importance of family and tradition. My mother had immediately begun planning our future wedding, and my father had started talking about David as if he were already a son. Even my sisters had seemed relieved that I had finally found someone who could anchor me to the life they believed I should be living. Our relationship had developed quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. David was charming and attentive, and he had made it clear from the beginning that he was looking for a wife, not just a girlfriend. He had traditional values that aligned with my family's expectations, and he had spoken often about wanting to build a life together that would honor both of our families' legacies. The proposal had come during a family barbecue at my parents' house, surrounded by all the people we loved most. David had gotten down on one knee in front of everyone, presenting me with a stunning diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother. The moment had been perfect, like something out of a fairy tale, and I had said yes amid the tears and cheers of our combined families. The engagement period had been a whirlwind of wedding planning and celebration. My mother had thrown herself into organizing what she called the wedding of the century, coordinating with David's mother to plan an elaborate celebration at the Arizona Biltmore that would accommodate 400 guests. The guest list included extended family from both sides, business associates, and prominent members of the Phoenix community. But as the wedding date approached, I had begun to experience a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite articulate. David had started making casual comments about my career that had made me uncomfortable. He had suggested that once we were married, I might want to consider working part-time or perhaps starting my own consulting firm that would give me more flexibility for family life. He had talked about wanting children right away and had expressed his belief that a mother should be home during the early years to provide stability and nurturing. These conversations had triggered something in me that I hadn't fully understood at the time. I had begun to realize that David, despite his modern success and sophisticated demeanor, held fundamentally traditional views about gender roles and family structure. He wanted a wife who would support his ambitions while subordinating her own, someone who would create a beautiful home and raise successful children while he focused on building his business empire. The breaking point had come 3 weeks before the wedding, during a casual dinner at David's apartment. We had been discussing the final details of our honeymoon plans when he had mentioned that he had already spoken to my supervisor at Henderson Engineering about transitioning me to part-time status after we returned from our trip to Italy. "You talked to my boss without discussing it with me first?" I had asked, feeling a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. "I wanted to make sure they could accommodate the change," he had replied, seeming genuinely confused by my reaction. "I thought you'd be pleased that I was handling the details. You have so much on your plate with the wedding preparations." "But we never agreed that I would go part-time," I had said, trying to keep my voice level. "I love my job. I've worked hard to build my reputation at the firm. I don't want to step back now." David had set down his wine glass and looked at me with the patient expression that I was beginning to recognize as condescending. "Rebecca, we've talked about this. You can't build a strong marriage and family while working 60-hour weeks. Something has to give, and naturally it should be the job, not the family." "Why naturally?" I had asked. "Your work is important, but so is mine. I design structures that will be standing long after we're both gone. I solve problems that affect thousands of people. Why should I be the one to sacrifice my ambitions?" "Because you're going to be a wife and mother," he had replied, as if stating an obvious fact. "That's the most important job in the world. Everything else is secondary." The conversation had continued late into the evening, becoming increasingly heated as we revealed fundamental differences in our visions for our future together. David had been genuinely shocked by my resistance to his plans, and I had been equally shocked by the depth of his expectations that I would completely reshape my life to accommodate his vision of our marriage. 2 weeks before the wedding, I had made the most difficult decision of my life. I had called off the engagement, returning the ring, and trying to explain to David that we wanted different things out of life. He had been devastated and angry, unable to understand how I could throw away what he saw as a perfect partnership for the sake of a job. My family's reaction had been even more difficult to bear. My parents had been heartbroken, not just about the end of the engagement, but about what they saw as my rejection of everything they valued most. My mother had cried for days, mourning not just the lost wedding, but the grandchildren she had already imagined. My father had been angry and disappointed, unable to comprehend how I could choose career ambition over love and family stability. Carmen and Isabella had tried to mediate, but they had ultimately sided with my parents, believing that I was making a terrible mistake that I would regret for the rest of my life. They had argued that marriage required compromise and that I should have found a way to make things work with David rather than walking away from such a good man. The aftermath had been brutal. The wedding cancellation had been the talk of our community, with opinions split between those who supported my decision to prioritize my own happiness and those who viewed me as selfish and ungrateful. David had eventually left Phoenix, moving to Las Vegas to focus on expanding his business there, but not before making his feelings about my decision very clear to anyone who would listen. My relationship with my family had deteriorated rapidly. What had started as disappointment had evolved into a cold distance that made family gatherings uncomfortable and strained. I had continued working at Henderson Engineering, throwing myself into my projects with even greater intensity, but the joy I had once found in my work had been diminished by the isolation I felt from the people I loved most. The final break had come during Carmen's birthday party 2 years after the canceled wedding. I had attended the celebration at my parents' house, hoping that enough time had passed for us to begin healing our relationships. But throughout the evening, I had felt like an outsider looking in on the life I had chosen to reject.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My cousins and family friends had asked polite questions about my work and my personal life, but I could sense the judgment behind their curiosity. The breaking point had come when my Aunt Patricia, who had perhaps had too much wine, had made a comment about how I was getting older and how difficult it would become to find another man like David who would be willing to take on a career-focused woman approaching 30. The comment had been meant as concern, but it had felt like an attack on the choices I had made and the life I was trying to build. I had left the party early, and in the days that followed, I had made the decision to accept a position with Stevens Architecture and Engineering in Denver, Colorado. The firm had been recruiting me for months, offering a significant salary increase and the opportunity to work on cutting-edge sustainable building projects that aligned with my professional interests and personal values. The move to Denver had been presented to my family as a temporary career opportunity, something that would enhance my experience and potentially lead to better opportunities back in Phoenix. But deep down, I think we all knew that I was running away from the disappointment and judgment that had made my hometown feel suffocating. Denver had been a revelation. The city was full of young professionals who shared my values and ambitions, people who understood that career fulfillment could be just as important as family life. I had found a community of like-minded individuals who supported each other's professional growth and celebrated success without judgment about personal choices. My work at Stevens Architecture and Engineering had been challenging and rewarding. I had been promoted twice in 4 years and had become the lead structural engineer on several high-profile sustainable building projects. My designs had been featured in architectural magazines, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about innovative approaches to environmentally conscious construction. But despite my professional success and the fulfilling life I had built in Denver, I had never stopped missing my family. I had maintained minimal contact with my parents and sisters, exchanging birthday cards and holiday greetings, but the warmth and intimacy that had once defined our relationships had never fully returned. The phone call from my mother 3 weeks ago had been unexpected. She had called to tell me that my father was retiring after 40 years of building and running Martinez Construction. The company had grown beyond anything he had imagined when he started with his pickup truck and toolbox, and he had decided to sell the business to a larger construction firm while remaining as a consultant for the transition period. "We're having a big retirement party for him," my mother had explained, her voice carefully neutral. "All the family will be there, plus his business associates and friends from the community. It's going to be at the Phoenician Resort on Saturday, April 15th. Your father would like you to be there." The invitation had surprised me. After 4 years of polite but distant communication, I hadn't expected to be included in such an important family celebration. When I had expressed my desire to attend, my mother's hesitation had been palpable. "Rebecca, you have to understand that this is going to be very difficult," she had said quietly. "David will be there. His family and ours are still very close, and he's been helping your father with some of the legal aspects of selling the business. There are going to be a lot of people there who remember what happened with the wedding." "Mom, that was 4 years ago," I had replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Surely people have moved on, and I can handle seeing David. We're both adults, it's not just about David," she had continued. "Your father is still hurt, Rebecca. He doesn't understand why you chose to move so far away, why you've built this whole life in Colorado that doesn't include us. He feels like he failed as a father, like he somehow drove you away." The pain in my mother's voice had cut through me like a blade. I had never intended to hurt my father, had never wanted him to feel like a failure.
but I also couldn't explain the suffocating feeling I had experienced trying to live up to expectations that didn't align with my own values and dreams. "I want to come home, Mom," I had said, the words carrying more emotional weight than I had intended. "I want to celebrate Dad's retirement and show him that I'm proud of everything he's accomplished. Maybe it's time for us to finally have the conversations we should have had years ago." The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother ultimately agreeing that I should attend the party, but her warnings about the potential difficulties had been clear, and I had understood that my presence might create tension rather than healing. Over the following weeks, I had wrestled with the decision. Part of me wanted to stay in Denver, to continue building the life I had created away from the complications of family expectations and judgment. But a larger part of me missed the warmth and connection that had once defined my relationship with my parents and sisters. I missed the Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations, the sense of belonging to something larger than myself. More importantly, I had a secret that had been weighing on me for months, something that I believed could change my family's perception of my choices and possibly heal the wounds that had divided us for so long. It was this secret that had ultimately convinced me to book the flight to Phoenix, despite the risks and potential complications. The secret was David Hernandez, or more specifically, what I had learned about David Hernandez. 6 months ago, I had been working on a project in Las Vegas, consulting on the structural engineering for a mixed-use development in the downtown area. During my time there, I had run into several people who knew David professionally, and through casual conversations, I had learned disturbing information about the man my family still viewed as the one who got away. David's business practices had become increasingly questionable over the years since our broken engagement. He had been involved in several developments that had cut corners on safety and environmental regulations, resulting in buildings that were profitable but potentially dangerous. More troubling, he had been accused by multiple former employees of creating hostile work environments, particularly for women, and had been the subject of several harassment complaints that had been quietly settled out of court. The information had been devastating to learn, not because I still had feelings for David, but because it had confirmed that my instincts about our incompatibility had been correct. The traditional values he had claimed to hold had apparently not extended to treating women with respect and dignity in professional settings. But the most shocking revelation had come from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, a former employee of David's company who had become a friend during my time in Las Vegas, had shared information about David's current situation that had left me stunned. David was in serious financial trouble. His aggressive expansion into Nevada markets had over-leveraged his company, and several major projects had fallen through due to the safety and environmental violations. He was facing potential bankruptcy and was desperately seeking investors to keep his business afloat. More relevantly to my family's situation, David had been reaching out to former business contacts, including my father, seeking financial backing for his struggling ventures. Maria had seen correspondence indicating that David had been presenting himself as a successful developer who was expanding his operations, when in reality he was on the verge of losing everything. This information had weighed heavily on me for months. My father was a savvy businessman, but he had always operated in the Arizona market with established relationships and traditional approaches to construction. The sophisticated financial manipulations and regulatory violations that characterized David's operations were outside his experience, and I feared that his personal affection for David might cloud his business judgment. The decision to return to Phoenix had been driven by my desire to protect my father from a potentially devastating business relationship, but it had also represented an opportunity to prove that my career choices had been valuable and meaningful. I had spent 4 years becoming an expert in sustainable construction practices and innovative building technologies, knowledge that could benefit my father's business and potentially save him from making a costly mistake. As the plane began its descent into Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, I could see the sprawling desert city spread out below me, the familiar grid of streets and the mountains rising in the distance. The sight filled me with a mixture of nostalgia and anxiety, memories of childhood and family competing with the knowledge of the difficult conversations that lay ahead. I had decided not to tell my family about my discovery regarding David's true situation until I could assess the dynamics at the retirement party. I wanted to understand how involved my father had become with David's business ventures, and how receptive my family might be to hearing information that contradicted their positive impression of the man they still viewed as my lost opportunity for happiness. The Phoenix airport was exactly as I remembered it, busy and modern with the distinctive southwestern architectural touches that gave it character. As I waited for my luggage, I caught glimpses of myself in the reflective surfaces around the terminal. 4 years in Denver had changed me in subtle ways. I looked more confident, more sophisticated, but also somewhat harder than the young woman who had left Arizona with her heart broken and her family relationships in ruins. I had reserved a rental car and hotel room, deciding that staying with my parents would be too emotionally intense, given the uncertainty about how the weekend would unfold. The drive from the airport to my hotel in Scottsdale took me through familiar neighborhoods, past the construction sites where my father's company had built homes and businesses that had become part of the landscape of my childhood. The hotel room was modern and comfortable, with a view of Camelback Mountain that reminded me of why I had always loved the desert landscape despite the complications of my family relationships. I unpacked my clothes for the weekend, hanging up the elegant black dress I had chosen for the retirement party, something sophisticated enough to show my success but not so flashy as to seem like I was trying to prove a point. That evening, I had dinner alone at a restaurant near my hotel, observing the familiar rhythms of Phoenix life and preparing myself mentally for the challenges of the next day. I had considered calling my parents to let them know I had arrived safely, but I decided to wait until the party to make my presence known. There would be enough drama and emotion to navigate without adding the complexity of private family conversations beforehand. The retirement party was scheduled to begin at 6 o'clock Saturday evening, and I spent the day exploring parts of Phoenix I had never seen during my years growing up there. The city had grown and evolved significantly, with new developments and cultural attractions that reflected its increasing sophistication and diversity. I found myself appreciating aspects of my hometown that I had never noticed before, seeing it through the eyes of someone who had lived elsewhere and could recognize its unique character and beauty. As the afternoon progressed, my anxiety about the evening ahead intensified. I had played out numerous scenarios in my mind, imagining different ways the evening might unfold and trying to prepare responses to the various reactions I might encounter. Would my family be genuinely happy to see me, or would my presence create tension that overshadowed my father's celebration? How would David react to seeing me again, and how would his presence affect my ability to have meaningful conversations with my family members? The most important question was whether I would find the right opportunity to share what I had learned about David's business situation. The information was sensitive and potentially explosive, and I knew that delivering it poorly could backfire and damage my relationships even further. But I also knew that remaining silent could allow my father to make financial decisions that could jeopardize everything he had worked to build over 4 decades. As I prepared for the party, applying makeup and styling my hair, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was struck by how much I resembled my mother at the same age. We had the same dark eyes and strong cheekbones, the same determined expression that emerged when we were facing challenges. The resemblance reminded me that despite our differences about life choices and priorities, we shared fundamental qualities of strength and resilience that had been passed down through generations of strong women. The drive to the Phoenician resort took me through some of the most beautiful parts of Scottsdale, past luxury developments and desert landscapes that showcased the natural beauty that had drawn so many people to Arizona over the years. The resort itself was elegant and impressive, the kind of venue that reflected my father's success and the esteem in which he was held by the business community. As I pulled into the resort parking lot, I could see that the party was already well underway. Cars filled the lot, many of them expensive vehicles that suggested the guest list included some of Phoenix's most successful business leaders. Through the windows of the main ballroom, I could see people dressed in elegant attire, talking and laughing in the warm glow of carefully designed lighting. I sat in my rental car for several minutes, gathering my courage and trying to calm my racing heart. 4 years of separation and hurt feelings were about to be confronted in a very public setting, surrounded by family, friends, and business associates who would be watching and judging every interaction. The weight of the secret I carried about David added another layer of complexity to an already emotionally charged situation. Taking a deep breath, I checked my appearance one final time in the rearview mirror, grabbed my small clutch purse, and stepped out of the car. The desert evening air was warm and comfortable, with the familiar scent of creosote and sage that I had missed during my years in Colorado. The sound of music and conversation drifted from the resort, creating an atmosphere of celebration that made my anxiety feel even more acute. As I walked toward the main entrance of the resort, I could see through the large windows into the ballroom where the party was being held. The room was beautifully decorated with flowers and lighting that created an elegant atmosphere appropriate for honoring my father's 4 decades of hard work and success. I could see familiar figures moving through the crowd, family members and family friends that I hadn't seen in years. And there, near the center of the room, standing next to my father and engaged in animated conversation, was David Hernandez. He looked exactly as I remembered him, handsome and confident, dressed in an expensive suit that suggested continued success and prosperity. The sight of him brought back a flood of complicated emotions, not romantic feelings, but memories of the conflict and disappointment that had led to our broken engagement and my eventual estrangement from my family. What struck me most was how comfortable he looked, how clearly he belonged in this setting with my family and their friends. It reinforced my understanding that my absence had created a space that he had continued to fill, maintaining relationships and connections that I had abandoned when I moved to Denver. The moment of truth had arrived. In a few minutes, I would walk into that ballroom and announce my presence to people who hadn't seen me in 4 years. People who had opinions about my choices and judgments about the path I had taken. I would face my family's mixed emotions about my return, David's potential shock at seeing me, and the broader social dynamics of a community that remembered my canceled wedding as a source of drama and disappointment. But I would also have the opportunity to honor my father's achievements, to show my family that distance hadn't diminished my love for them, and potentially to protect them from making a costly business mistake. The evening would be difficult and emotionally intense, but it also represented the possibility of healing and redemption that had eluded us for too long. With one final deep breath, I approached the entrance to the resort, ready to face whatever consequences my decision to return home might bring. I walked through the elegant lobby of the Phoenician resort, my heels clicking against the marble floors as I approached the ballroom entrance. The sound of laughter and conversation grew louder with each step, and I could smell the familiar aroma of my mother's favorite catering company, the one she always hired for special occasions. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone would be able to hear it over the music. The ballroom doors were open, and I could see inside to where at least 200 people were gathered, celebrating my father's 4 decades of success. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables covered in cream-colored linens, and enormous arrangements of desert wildflowers created splashes of color throughout the room. A large banner reading "Congratulations Miguel Martinez 40 Years of Excellence" hung across the back wall, with photo displays showing the evolution of Martinez construction from a single pickup truck to a fleet of vehicles and major construction projects throughout Arizona. I paused just outside the entrance, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. My stomach dropped when I spotted David immediately. He was standing near the bar, looking exactly as polished and confident as I remembered, engaged in what appeared to be an intense business conversation with 3 older men I recognized as prominent Phoenix developers. His laugh carried across the room, that same charming sound that had once made my heart flutter but now filled me with a mixture of dread and determination. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the ballroom. The first person to notice me was my cousin Elena, who was standing near the entrance greeting late arrivals. Her face went completely white when she saw me, and she actually took a step backward, her mouth falling open in shock.
"Rebecca," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe her eyes, "what are you doing here?" "I came to celebrate Dad's retirement," I said simply, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Is that such a surprise?" Elena's eyes darted nervously around the room. "But nobody said you were coming. Your mother didn't mention it. Does she know you're here?" Before I could answer, Elena's reaction had caught the attention of several other family members nearby. My Aunt Carmen, my father's sister, turned to see what had caused Elena's obvious distress. When she saw me, her expression shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like panic. "Rebecca dear," Aunt Carmen said, hurrying over to us, her voice carefully controlled but urgent. "What a surprise to see you here. Are you sure this is a good idea?"
The implication was clear. My presence was already being viewed as a potential problem, something that might disrupt the carefully orchestrated celebration. I could feel other people beginning to notice the commotion, heads turning in our direction, conversations pausing as recognition dawned on faces throughout the room. "It's my father's retirement party," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the growing attention. "I belong here just as much as anyone else." Aunt Carmen glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the scene that was developing. "Of course you do, sweetheart. It's just that your presence might be unexpected for some people." She didn't have to specify which people she meant. Through the crowd, I could see that David had noticed the disturbance and was looking in our direction, his business conversation forgotten. Even from across the room, I could see the moment of recognition cross his face, followed by an expression I couldn't quite read. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked Elena, deciding that the best strategy was to face the inevitable confrontation head-on rather than skulking around the edges of the party. "They're over by the head table," Elena said, pointing toward the front of the room. "But Rebecca, maybe you should wait a few minutes, let people adjust to seeing you here before." "Before what?" I interrupted. "Before I approach my own parents at their celebration." The crowd was beginning to part as word of my arrival spread through the room. I could hear the whispered conversations starting, people leaning close to each other to share their shock and speculation about why I had suddenly appeared after 4 years of absence. The weight of their attention was oppressive, but I forced myself to stand straight and move forward with purpose. As I walked through the ballroom toward my parents, I caught fragments of conversations that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "Is that Rebecca Martinez? I thought she moved away years ago. She's the one who left David Hernandez at the altar, remember? What is she doing here? This is going to be so awkward. She looks good though. Success must be treating her well. Poor Miguel and Rosa, they don't need this drama tonight." I kept walking, focusing on reaching my parents while trying to ignore the buzz of speculation and judgment surrounding me. Through the crowd, I could see my mother first. She was standing near the head table, wearing an elegant navy blue dress that I recognized as her favorite formal outfit, the one she saved for the most important occasions. She was engaged in conversation with several wives of my father's business partners, her face animated and happy as she played the perfect hostess. My father was a few feet away, surrounded by a group of men who were clearly hanging on his every word, as he told what was probably a story about one of his construction projects. He looked distinguished and proud, in his best black suit, his graying hair neatly styled, and his face showing the satisfaction of a man who had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. Neither of them had noticed me yet, and I hesitated for a moment, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the tone for everything that followed. This was my father's night, his moment of triumph and celebration, and the last thing I wanted was to overshadow his achievements with family drama. But I had come too far to turn back now. I had information that could protect him from making a potentially devastating mistake, and despite the complicated history between us, he deserved to know the truth about David's situation before making any financial commitments. I was still about 20 feet away from my parents when my mother happened to glance in my direction. The change in her expression was immediate and dramatic. The smile vanished from her face, replaced by a look of complete shock that quickly shifted to something that looked almost like fear. She actually stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady herself against the back of a nearby chair. "Miguel," she called to my father, her voice sharp with urgency. "Miguel, you need to see this." My father turned at the sound of his wife's distressed tone, scanning the crowd to see what had upset her. When his eyes found me, he went completely still. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other across the crowded room, 4 years of separation and hurt feelings, creating a gulf that seemed impossible to bridge. The conversations around us had died to a whisper as more and more people became aware of the family drama unfolding before them. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, could practically hear the collective intake of breath as the party guests waited to see how this unexpected reunion would play out. I forced myself to take the final steps toward my parents, stopping just a few feet away from where they stood. Up close, I could see that my mother's eyes were already filling with tears, though whether they were tears of joy or distress, I couldn't tell. My father's expression was unreadable, a carefully controlled mask that revealed nothing of what he was feeling. "Hello, Dad," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the music that was still playing despite the fact that most conversations had stopped. "Congratulations on your retirement." For what felt like an eternity, he didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 4 years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Around us, the party guests were trying to pretend they weren't watching and listening to every word, but I could feel their attention like a physical weight. Finally, my father spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Rebecca, this is unexpected. I wanted to be here to honor everything you've accomplished." I replied, searching his face for some sign of welcome or warmth. 40 years of building something meaningful, something that will last, that deserves to be celebrated. My mother had moved closer during this exchange, and I could see her struggling with conflicting emotions. Part of her was clearly happy to see me, her maternal instincts overriding her concerns about the potential complications my presence might create. But another part of her was obviously worried about the impact my arrival might have on the evening and on my father's emotional state. "Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We could have prepared people, made arrangements. I wasn't sure until the last minute that I would actually go through with it," I admitted. "I know my being here complicates things." "Complicates things?" The voice came from behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know who was speaking. David Hernandez had approached our small group, and his tone carried an edge that suggested he was not pleased by my unexpected appearance. I turned slowly to face him, taking in his familiar features and the expensive suit that spoke of continued success and prosperity. He looked older than I remembered, with a few lines around his eyes and a slightly harder set to his jaw, but he was still undeniably handsome and charismatic. "Hello, David," I said, proud that my voice remained steady despite the churning in my stomach. "It's been a long time." 4 years, he replied, his eyes never leaving my face. 4 years since you decided that your career was more important than our future together." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I could feel the party guests around us leaning in closer, eager to witness this confrontation between the woman who had broken off her engagement and the man who had been left behind. My parents looked mortified, clearly uncomfortable with having their family drama played out so publicly. "I decided that we wanted different things out of life," I corrected gently, trying to keep the conversation from escalating into the kind of scene that would completely overshadow my father's celebration. "We both deserve to find partners who shared our visions for the future." David laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "And how has that worked out for you, Rebecca? Are you happy with the choice you made? Have you found someone who appreciates your dedication to your career over everything else?" The personal attack stung, particularly because it touched on the loneliness that had been a constant companion during my years in Denver. I had built a successful career and a fulfilling professional life, but my personal relationships had indeed suffered. The long hours and intense focus required by my work had made it difficult to maintain romantic relationships, and I had often wondered whether I had made the right choice in prioritizing my career over the stability that marriage to David might have provided. But I also remembered the suffocating feeling I had experienced when contemplating a future where my ambitions would be subordinated to traditional expectations, where my identity would be defined primarily by my roles as wife and mother rather than by my professional achievements. "I've built something meaningful," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I've designed structures that will improve people's lives, created sustainable solutions to complex problems. I'm proud of what I've accomplished." "Alone," David added, the word carrying unmistakable cruelty. "You've accomplished it all alone, without the support and love that comes from building a life with someone else." My father chose that moment to intervene, stepping slightly between David and me in a gesture that felt protective. "This is not the time or place for this conversation," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him successful in business. "This is supposed to be a celebration." David nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You're absolutely right, Miguel. Tonight is about celebrating your incredible achievements and the legacy you've built. I apologize for letting my emotions get the better of me." The apology was directed to my father, not to me, and the message was clear. David was positioning himself as the respectful family friend, while I was the disruptive presence who had upset the evening's harmony. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to compose ourselves," my mother suggested, her voice shaking slightly. "Rebecca, would you like to get some air?" The suggestion was clearly an attempt to remove me from the situation before it could escalate further, and I recognized the wisdom in it. But I also knew that stepping away now would only reinforce the perception that my presence was problematic and unwelcome. Actually, I think I'd like to stay and enjoy the party, I said, trying to project confidence. I haven't seen many of these people in years, and I'd love to hear more about Dad's plans for retirement. My father's expression softened slightly at my words, and I caught a glimpse of the man who had once been my hero, who had taught me to appreciate craftsmanship and integrity in all aspects of life. Well, he said slowly, I suppose if you're here, you should stay and enjoy yourself. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it wasn't a rejection either. I felt a small surge of hope that perhaps the evening might not be the complete disaster I had feared. David, however, was not ready to let the matter drop. Miguel, before Rebecca gets too comfortable, I think there's something important we need to discuss, about the investment opportunity we've been talking about. My blood ran cold. This was exactly what I had feared, exactly why I'd felt compelled to return to Phoenix despite the emotional risks. David was about to propose some kind of business deal to my father, potentially using their personal relationship and my family's continued positive impression of him to secure financial backing for his failing ventures. What investment opportunity? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual while my mind raced with alarm. David's smile was sharp and predatory. Your father and I have been discussing some exciting possibilities for expanding into the Nevada market. My company has identified several high-potential development projects that would benefit from partnering with someone of your father's experience and reputation. The words were carefully chosen to sound legitimate and appealing, but I could hear the desperation underneath. David needed my father's money to save his failing business, and he was willing to exploit their personal relationship to get it. That sounds like something that should be discussed privately between you and Dad, I said carefully, not wanting to reveal my knowledge of David's true situation in such a public setting. Business decisions require careful consideration and due diligence. Absolutely, David agreed, but his tone suggested he found my input unwelcome. Which is why your father and I have been taking our time thoroughly researching all the opportunities and potential risks. I looked at my father, trying to gauge his level of enthusiasm for whatever David was proposing. His expression was thoughtful but not uncommitted, suggesting that he was seriously considering the partnership. Dad, maybe we could talk about this later, I suggested. Tonight should be about celebrating your achievements with Martinez Construction, not planning new ventures. My father nodded slowly, but I could see that David's mention of the investment opportunity had captured his interest. He had built his success through calculated risks and strategic partnerships, and the idea of expanding into new markets clearly appealed to his entrepreneurial instincts. You're right that tonight is about celebration, my father said. But I'm always interested in discussing opportunities for growth and expansion. David's smile widened, and I realized with growing alarm that he was going to use the party setting to his advantage, presenting his proposals in front of family and friends who would create social pressure for my father to respond positively. Actually, Miguel, since Rebecca is here, perhaps this is the perfect time to discuss the Nevada projects, David said, his tone becoming more confident. After all, she works in construction and engineering. She might have valuable insights to offer. The suggestion was clearly a challenge, a way of putting me on the spot and potentially exposing my concerns about his business practices in front of the entire party. If I raised objections to his proposals, I would appear to be the jealous ex-fiancé trying to sabotage his relationship with my family. If I remained silent, I would be allowing him to potentially manipulate my father into a dangerous financial commitment. I'd be happy to listen to what you're proposing, I said carefully, accepting the challenge while buying myself time to figure out how to handle the situation. David gestured toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where several chairs had been arranged around a small table. Why don't we step over here where we can have a more detailed conversation? As we moved away from the main crowd, I caught sight of my sisters for the first time that evening. Carmen and Isabella were standing together near the dance floor, watching our group with expressions of obvious concern and curiosity. They had clearly been informed of my arrival, and were trying to assess the potential impact of my presence on the family dynamics. Carmen, ever the protective older sister, started to approach our group, but Isabella caught her arm and held her back. They exchanged a look that I recognized from childhood, a silent communication that suggested they had agreed to let the situation play out without interference, at least for the moment. We settled into chairs around the small table, creating an oddly intimate setting for what was clearly going to be a confrontational conversation. My parents flanked me on one side, while David sat across from us, his body language confident and relaxed despite the tension that was radiating from everyone else. "So tell us about these Nevada opportunities," my father said, leaning forward with genuine interest. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather portfolio, from which he extracted several professionally printed documents. The presentation materials looked impressive and legitimate, exactly the kind of polished marketing materials that would appeal to a successful businessman like my father. "I've identified 3 major development projects in the Las Vegas metropolitan area," David began, spreading the documents across the table. "Mixed-use developments that combine residential, commercial, and hospitality components. The market analysis shows tremendous potential for growth, particularly in the luxury segment." As he spoke, I found myself studying the materials he had presented, looking for signs of the financial difficulties and regulatory problems that I knew plagued his actual operations. The documents were beautifully designed and filled with impressive-looking charts and projections, but I noticed several red flags that my father might not recognize. The projected returns were unrealistically high, promising profits that would be difficult to achieve even under the best circumstances. The timeline for completion was aggressively optimistic, suggesting either inexperience with complex development projects or deliberate misrepresentation of the challenges involved. Most concerning, there was no mention of the regulatory approvals and environmental assessments that would be required for projects of this scope. "These numbers look very optimistic," I said carefully, pointing to one of the profit projections. "What kind of due diligence have you done on the regulatory environment in Nevada?" David's smile tightened slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "Nevada has a very business-friendly regulatory environment, much more streamlined than what we deal with here in Arizona." "That's not exactly true," I replied, drawing on my knowledge of interstate construction regulations. "Nevada has actually implemented stricter environmental standards over the past few years, particularly for large-scale developments. Have you factored in the costs of environmental impact studies and remediation?" The question hit its mark. David's hesitation was brief but noticeable, and I could see my father beginning to pick up on the inconsistencies in the presentation. "Of course we've considered all regulatory requirements," David said, but his tone had become defensive. "These projections include contingencies for all necessary approvals and assessments." I looked more closely at the financial projections, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. The numbers were not just optimistic, they were essentially fabricated, based on market conditions and cost assumptions that bore no resemblance to reality. "David," I said, keeping my voice level despite my growing alarm, "these cost estimates seem low for projects of this scope. Have you gotten actual bids from contractors and suppliers?" His face was starting to show signs of strain, perspiration forming on his forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the ballroom. "We're still in the preliminary stages of cost analysis. These are conservative estimates based on comparable projects." Conservative. I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. "These construction costs are at least 30% below current market rates for luxury developments. And the timeline assumes no delays for weather, regulatory reviews, or change orders." My father was now studying the documents with the critical eye of someone who had spent 4 decades managing complex construction projects. I could see him beginning to identify the same inconsistencies that had caught my attention. "David, these projections do seem aggressive," my father said slowly. "In my experience, development projects typically encounter unexpected costs and delays that can significantly impact profitability." David's confident demeanor was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny, and I realized that he had not expected to face this level of detailed questioning. He had probably assumed that my father would be swayed by their personal relationship and the impressive-looking presentation materials. "Miguel, you have to understand that the Nevada market offers opportunities that simply don't exist in Arizona," David said, his voice taking on a note of desperation. "The growth potential is extraordinary, and getting in on the ground floor of these developments could be incredibly lucrative. It could also be incredibly risky," I interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "Dad, I think you should have an independent consultant review these projections before making any commitments." David's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment his carefully maintained facade slipped completely. "I don't think Rebecca is in a position to offer business advice," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "She's been living in Colorado, working for someone else's company. She doesn't understand the entrepreneurial risks and rewards of development work." The personal attack was clearly intended to undermine my credibility and dismiss my concerns, but it had the opposite effect on my father. I could see his expression hardening as he recognized David's attempt to manipulate the conversation. "Rebecca has a degree in structural engineering and has been working on major construction projects for years," my father said firmly. "Her input is valuable, regardless of where she lives or who she works for." The defense of my expertise was unexpected and deeply gratifying, particularly coming from a man who had once questioned the value of my career choices. But David was not ready to abandon his sales pitch. "Of course, Rebecca's engineering background is valuable," he said, attempting to recover his composure. "But engineering and development are different disciplines. These projects require vision and risk tolerance, not just technical knowledge. They also require honesty and transparency," I said, deciding that the time had come to reveal what I knew about David's true situation. "Dad, I need to tell you something about David's current business situation." David's face went pale, and I could see panic beginning to replace anger in his expression. He knew that I had somehow discovered the truth about his financial difficulties, and he was realizing that his carefully orchestrated presentation was about to be exposed. "What are you talking about?" my father asked, looking between David and me with growing confusion. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to reveal would change everything, not just about the business discussion, but about my family's perception of the man they had continued to view as my lost opportunity for happiness. "David's company is in serious financial trouble," I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "He's facing potential bankruptcy, and he's been using misleading information to attract investors who can help him avoid losing everything." The silence that followed was deafening. My father stared at me in shock, while my mother's face reflected her struggle to process this unexpected information. David looked like he was about to be sick. "That's not true," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Rebecca is obviously still bitter about our broken engagement, and she's trying to sabotage my relationship with your family." "I have documentation," I replied calmly, reaching into my purse to retrieve the folder I had prepared with copies of the information Maria Gonzalez had shared with me. Financial records, regulatory violations, and correspondence with potential investors that shows a pattern of misrepresentation. My father reached for the folder, his business instincts overriding his personal feelings about the situation. As he began to examine the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Miguel, you can't seriously be considering information that Rebecca obtained through who knows what means," David protested. "This is clearly a vindictive attack by someone who can't stand to see me succeed." But my father was already deep into the financial records, and I could see recognition dawning in his eyes, as he identified the telltale signs of a company in distress. Cash flow problems, overdue payments to contractors, and regulatory fines that had been hidden from potential investors. "These are serious problems, David," my father said finally, looking up from the documents. "Why didn't you mention any of this when we started discussing potential partnerships?" David's last attempt at maintaining his facade crumbled completely. "Because I knew you wouldn't give me a chance if you thought I was struggling," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's exactly why I need this partnership. Your reputation and resources could turn everything around. By risking my life's work to save your failing business," my father asked, his tone cold and disappointed, "you would have let me invest my retirement savings in projects that you knew were based on false projections." The confrontation was attracting attention from other party guests, who were beginning to drift toward our corner of the ballroom, drawn by the obvious tension and raised voices. I could see my sisters approaching, along with several family friends who looked concerned about the drama unfolding at what was supposed to be a celebration. David stood up abruptly, his face flushed with humiliation and anger. "This is exactly what I should have expected from someone like you, Rebecca," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "You couldn't stand to see me happy and successful, so you've spent 4 years planning your revenge." The accusation was so unfair and so completely wrong that I felt my own anger flaring. "This has nothing to do with revenge," I replied, rising to face him. This has to do with protecting my father from being defrauded by someone he trusted. Defrauded? David's voice rose even higher. I offered him a legitimate business opportunity. The fact that my company is going through some temporary difficulties doesn't make it fraud. Temporary difficulties. I pulled out another document from my folder. You've been in violation of safety regulations on 3 separate projects. You've had 2 environmental citations that you've been fighting in court. You owe over $2 million to contractors and suppliers who haven't been paid for work completed months ago. Each revelation hit like a physical blow, and I could see David's carefully constructed image crumbling before our eyes. The confident, successful businessman that my family had continued to admire was revealed as desperate and potentially dishonest. My father stood up slowly, his face reflecting a mixture of disappointment and disgust. I think you should leave, David, he said quietly, but firmly. This conversation is over. David looked around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had witnessed his humiliation. Family members, business associates, and community leaders who had respected him were now staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to contempt. This isn't over, he said, his voice shaking with rage as he pointed at me. You think you've won something here, but all you've done is destroy any chance of rebuilding your relationship with your family. They'll never forgive you for ruining this evening. With that final threat, he turned and walked quickly toward the ballroom exit, leaving behind the presentation materials and the wreckage of his reputation. The room remained silent as people watched him go, the festive atmosphere of the retirement party completely shattered by the confrontation. I stood there in the aftermath, surrounded by my family and their guests, suddenly aware that I had achieved my goal of protecting my father from David's deception, but at a tremendous cost. The evening that was meant to celebrate my father's achievements had been turned into a spectacle of family drama and public humiliation. My mother was crying quietly, overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of the evening and the shocking revelations about David. My father was staring at the documents scattered across the table, still processing the fact that someone he had trusted had been prepared to betray that trust for financial gain. Carmen and Isabella had finally reached our group and were standing nearby, their faces reflecting their struggle to understand what had just happened and what it meant for our family's future. The party guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, no doubt discussing the dramatic scene they had just witnessed and speculating about its implications for the Martinez family. Some were already gathering their belongings, clearly feeling that the evening's entertainment had come to an end. I realized that I was standing at a crossroads. I had revealed the truth about David and potentially saved my father from a costly mistake, but I had also turned his retirement celebration into a nightmare of family conflict and public embarrassment. The question now was whether my actions would be seen as protective or destructive, whether I would be viewed as the daughter who had saved her father or the one who had ruined his special evening. As I looked around at the faces of my family members, I saw a mixture of emotions that I couldn't fully interpret. Shock, certainly, and confusion, but also something that might have been respect, or at least recognition that my motivations had been genuine, even if my methods had been dramatic. The next few minutes would determine whether the evening's revelations would lead to healing and reconciliation or to even deeper divisions within our family. I had taken an enormous risk in confronting David so publicly, and now I would have to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. The ballroom fell into an uncomfortable silence after David's dramatic exit. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me, some sympathetic, others judgmental, all waiting to see what would happen next. My father was still holding the documents that had exposed David's deception, his weathered hands trembling slightly as the full implications sank in. My mother wiped her tears with a cloth napkin, her mascara smudged but her posture straightening with newfound resolve. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something between gratitude and admiration. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmur of confused guests. "You saved your father from losing everything." My father set the papers down and looked directly at me for the first time all evening with genuine warmth in his eyes.
"I owe you an apology, Maya."
"And more than that, I owe you my respect." The words I had waited 4 years to hear finally came tumbling out of him. "When you called off that engagement, I thought you were throwing away your chance at happiness. I thought you were being stubborn and ungrateful. But you saw something in David that the rest of us missed completely. Carmen and Isabella had joined our small circle, their earlier reluctance replaced by protective concern for our parents and curiosity about my dramatic revelation. Carmen, ever practical, was already thinking ahead. "Dad, how much money were you considering investing?" she asked, scanning the fraudulent documents. $200,000, my father admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of what could have been lost. "My entire retirement savings plus a loan against the house." The magnitude of the near disaster hit everyone simultaneously. My mother gasped audibly, while my sisters exchanged alarmed glances. I felt a surge of relief that I had acted when I did, despite the dramatic scene it had created. "But how did you know?" Isabella asked me, her voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "How did you find out about David's problems?" I explained about my work in Las Vegas, the connections I had made there, and the information that had gradually revealed David's true situation. As I spoke, I could see understanding dawning on their faces, recognition that my career had provided me with knowledge and resources that had ultimately protected our family. The party guests had begun to disperse, many approaching my parents to offer support and express their shock about David's attempted deception. But several business associates lingered, clearly impressed by my professional insights and the decisive action I had taken. "Rebecca," called out Mr. Antonio Rivera, one of Phoenix's most successful developers and a longtime friend of my father's. "I was listening to your analysis of those Nevada projects. Your questions were exactly what any experienced developer should have asked." He approached our group with obvious admiration. "Your father has talked about you over the years, but I had no idea you had become such an accomplished professional. Are you considering returning to Phoenix? Because I could use someone with your expertise." The unexpected job offer caught me completely off guard, but before I could respond, my father stepped forward. "Rebecca has built an impressive career in Denver," he said with unmistakable pride. "She's the lead structural engineer on several major sustainable building projects. Her company was featured in Architectural Digest last year." The fact that my father knew these details about my professional achievements stunned me. Despite our years of limited contact, he had clearly been following my career and taking pride in my accomplishments, even if he had never expressed it directly. "Actually, Dad," I said, taking a deep breath and making a decision that surprised even me. "I've been thinking about making a change. My contract in Denver ends next month, and I've been considering my options." The words came out before I had fully processed the implications, but as I spoke them I realized they were true. The success I had achieved in Colorado felt hollow without the connection to family and community that I had sacrificed to attain it. "Stevens Architecture has been pushing me to transfer to their Phoenix office," I continued, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. "They want to expand their sustainable construction practice in the Southwest." My mother's face lit up with hope, while my father looked intrigued by the professional possibilities my return might represent. "We should talk more about this," Mr. Rivera interjected, handing me his business card. "Phoenix needs more professionals who understand both traditional construction and innovative green building practices." As the evening wound down, the family gathered around one of the quieter tables to process everything that had happened. The retirement celebration had certainly not unfolded as anyone had expected, but in its own dramatic way, it had accomplished something perhaps more important than a simple party. "I'm sorry I disrupted your special evening," I told my father, genuine regret in my voice, despite knowing I had made the right choice. He shook his head firmly. "You didn't disrupt anything, Bima. You protected our family and showed courage that I should have recognized years ago when you called off that engagement." Carmen reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I owe you an apology too. We all thought you were making a mistake, but you were trusting your instincts about David's character." "Those instincts were right about more than just David," Isabella added. "You knew what kind of life would make you happy, and you were brave enough to pursue it even when we didn't understand or support you." The conversation continued long after the last guests had departed, with years of misunderstandings finally being addressed honestly and openly. We talked about my parents' traditional expectations and my struggle to balance family loyalty with personal authenticity. We discussed the loneliness I had experienced in Denver and their regret about the way they had handled my broken engagement. As we prepared to leave the resort, my father pulled me aside for a private moment. "I want you to consider something," he said, his voice serious but warm. "Martinez Construction may be sold, but I've been thinking about starting a consulting firm that focuses on sustainable renovation and green building practices. I could use a partner who understands both the technical and business sides of the industry." The offer represented everything I had hoped for but never dared to expect: professional recognition from my father, the opportunity to work alongside him as an equal partner, and a chance to contribute my expertise to building something meaningful in my hometown. "I don't need an answer tonight," he continued, "but I want you to know that I finally understand what you've been working toward all these years. And I'm proud of the woman you've become, even if it took me too long to say so." 6 months later, I was standing in the newly renovated offices of Martinez Verde Consulting, watching my father explain our sustainable renovation approach to a potential client. The company name, suggested by my mother, reflected both our family legacy and our commitment to environmentally conscious building practices. The transition back to Phoenix had been smoother than I had expected, aided by the warm welcome I received from the professional community and the excitement around our innovative approach to construction consulting. Carmen and Isabella had become enthusiastic supporters of my work, often referring friends and neighbors who were interested in green home improvements. Most surprisingly, my return had coincided with meeting Dr. Sarah Chen, a fellow engineer, who had relocated to Phoenix to work on renewable energy projects. Our relationship had developed naturally, built on shared professional interests and mutual respect for each other's achievements and ambitions. The evening that had begun as my father's retirement party had ultimately become the catalyst for healing old wounds and building new possibilities. Sometimes the most important transformations happen not through careful planning, but through the courage to speak difficult truths and the willingness to forgive past misunderstandings. Standing in our office that morning, watching my father share his decades of construction wisdom with our latest client, while incorporating the sustainable practices I had brought from my years in Colorado, I realized that I had finally found what I had been searching for all along: a way to honor both my professional ambitions and my deep connection to family and community. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.